Rock and roll sensation Ritchie Valens, singer of the smash hit La Bamba, dies in a tragic plane crash at the age of 17. Because he was still a minor, his estate goes directly to his mother. The cause of the tragic crash that took Ritchie's life remains a mystery, and for some, highly controversial.
Were there shots fired in the plane? Was there an argument?
As Ritchie Valens' fame grows in the decades following his death, a legal battle begins.
He goes, "When are you gonna stop suing me?"
And new information is revealed about a cross-country bus trip that ended on the day the music died. At 12:50 a.m. on February 3, 1959, a tiny Beechcraft Bonanza airplane flies low over Iowa farmland. On board are three of the most famous rock stars in the country: Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, and Ritchie Valens. They're on their way to the next gig of their winter dance party tour. Author Larry Lemmer has written an in-depth investigation of the events surrounding that fateful flight.
The weather was kind of typical Midwestern weather at that time. The temperature was in the upper teens. It was windy. There was just a little bit of snow in the air. The ceiling seemed to be okay. Roger Peterson, the pilot, was hoping that he'd be able to fly under visual flight conditions all the way to Fargo, since he wasn't qualified to fly on instruments. But there was a front moving in, and the conditions were not that great.
The owner of the aircraft, Bob Dwyer, watches the plane take off. But when he tries to make radio contact a short time later, he gets no response. Then, the unthinkable happens.
The plane went down 5 miles from the airport, killing everybody on board, including Roger Peterson, the Big Bopper, Ritchie Valens, and Buddy Holly.
Ritchie's sister Connie was 8 years old.
And I remember running in the house and seeing Mama sitting in a chair. And I thought, why is my mom sitting in the chair in the middle of the living room? And around her are all of Ritchie's friends.
Ritchie's other sister, Irma, was only 7 at the time.
I remember getting to the house. I seen a lot of girls, a lot of guys, everybody in front of my mother's house. And I says, "Oh, Connie, I think we're having a party."
Ritchie's older brother, Bob, also rushed home when he heard the news.
And I got to the house, opened the door, and there were 2 of Ritchie's friends, one on each side of my mom, and they were walking down the hallway, and she looked at me and she says, "We lost your brother."
Perhaps hardest hit by Ritchie's death is his mother, Concepcion.
And when people would come over to the house, Mama had a beautiful stereo Ritchie had bought her, and she'd be playing his albums, his music. And they would say, "Concha, why do you have music on?" And she'd say, "If I don't listen to his music, I'll die." She would say, "I'll die."
Ritchie's youngest brother, Mario, was only 2 years old at the time, but he remembers how his mother honored the memory of her dead son.
Every time on his birthday, you know, we'd put on, you know, his music, you know, she would say, "Come on, let's dance. We got to dance this music away." So it'd be sad, but I mean, it was a good thing.
In 1971, 12 years after the crash, the tragedy is immortalized in the Don McLean song American Pie as "The Day the Music Died." And this phrase will become the title to Larry Lemmer's book about the crash.
Plane crash that killed Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper certainly created the first martyrs of rock and roll. Their deaths had a massive impact on the youth of America.
Author Gary Moore has also written about the plane crash in his book, Hey Buddy.
It blew a hole in U.S. rock and roll. And really, Some experts say that February 3rd, 1959 made the British invasion of rock and roll possible.
Remarkably, despite Valens' untimely death, he remains enormously influential.
It was a groundbreaking career he had, as brief as it was. Just to get his kind of music out there was really unusual at the time. You just didn't hear music like that. La Bamba was something that was totally unique to most rock and roll fans at the time.
According to some critics, Valens' three-chord groove in La Bamba informed the next 20 years of rock history, influencing iconic hits like Twist and Shout, as well as songs by the Kingsmen, the Kinks, the Ramones, and the Stooges, among others. Today, he's one of only a few Mexican Americans in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Richie was, I think, clearly the greatest performer of the three. He was maintaining his Spanish-Mexican influence on the music, and it was being accepted by the Anglo population, which people said couldn't happen at that time.
Valens' fame and influence is particularly extraordinary considering that his entire career, from the release of his first single, Come On, Let's Go, to his death, was 1 year long. He was too young to have even thought about drafting a will, and his career was so short-lived that he hadn't even started collecting royalties from his 3 back-to-back hit singles.
What Richie Valens' earning potential would be, you can only guess. He was incredibly popular.
Born Richard Stephen Valenzuela in Los Angeles, California on May 13, 1941, Richie Valens' brief life was the epitome of the American dream. He rose to stardom from a background of poverty. His father died when Richie was only 10. From then on, Valens lived with his mother, Concepcion, in a household that included his older brother Bob and his younger siblings Connie, Irma, and Mario. The family was penniless.
Most of us are poor until we get our check. But we were impoverished. That's a big difference. We didn't have anywhere to go. And he was the guy that was going to take us somewhere through his music.
Before he died, Richie's father, Steve, had taught him how to play the guitar.
His dad was a guitar player, and when his parents divorced, he lived with his dad. And Richie would play along with his dad a lot of times. So he got really interested in music at a young age.
My dad used to have barbecues over at the house, and my cousins would come down and the weekend and they'd play, and most of them played Latin music, so they played La Bamba a lot. And Richie was about 5, 6 years old when he started to strum on a guitar, and they taught him a couple of moves on the guitar, and he took it from there on.
He picked up the guitar, started learning how to play, then from there, he was gone. It was in his heart and soul, and that was a mission that he had to go do, and and just go for it.
To me, he was just my brother, and sometimes he used to get on my nerves. He was always playing,
In junior high, in shop class, he refinished a guitar, and he played that. And he had a little amplifier that he'd carry around, and he would play it for anybody that would listen.
In 1956, Richie decides to take his obsession with music to the next level.
Richie joined a band called the Silhouettes, and they were real interested in getting a tape to a guy named Bob Keane. And he listened to him, and somebody asked him, well, what do you think about that group? And he said that, well, the group wasn't that hot, but that kid singing and playing guitar, he sounded really good.
Keane contacts Richie and offers to record him.
The big song that Richie was working on at the time Bob Keane met him was Come On, Let's Go. So Bob Keane gave the song a little structure, and they put it together and recorded it. And he took a tape of it down to KFWB, a station down in Southern California.
I think we were in the car with Mama, and we had it on KFWB, which was the rock and roll station, and all of a sudden there it was, and we were just all like,
Come On, Let's Go came out in 1959 and was a hit. By the end of 1959, he had come out with Donna and La Bamba, and those were monster hits. Those both earned him gold records.
Richie was getting more famous, And all the girls that would hear his music would jump and dance. Some would even cry.
By the end of 1958, Ritchie had gone from unknown high school student to teen phenomenon, headlining the Winter Dance Party, a tour of the Midwestern states with the established rock star Buddy Holly. The Winter Dance Party tour begins in late January, and although it gets off to a good start, things go rapidly downhill as the tour buses prove to be ill-suited to the weather conditions.
They weren't adequate for touring in the upper Midwest in really cold and snowy conditions. And the touring was arduous, and the buses kept breaking down. They kept having to send out new buses.
It was a horrible situation, and all the artists were calling home complaining, but you know, the show must go on, and it did.
Their drummer, Carl Bunch, kept putting on pairs of socks on his feet, thinking that would keep his feet warm, and his feet would sweat, and then they would freeze. And he suffered a very severe case of frostbite, ended up in the hospital there, and the tour had to go on without him.
There was one point where the bus actually broke down in the middle of a blizzard on the road. And the boys got out trying to flag people down. Finally, a sheriff or a cop came, police officer came by, took a couple of the guys into town. They brought out another bus, and they had to transfer all of this equipment. And this is in sub-zero weather. These guys, half of them, didn't know what the weather was going to be like.
As the tour winds its way through the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa, the situation grows worse still.
You can imagine a school bus of the 1950s out on a two-lane hard road out there with wind blowing and snow falling. They're drafty, they're cold, they creep along, and frequently they would play a concert and drive all night after the concert, so they were on the road in the worst possible conditions.
I heard a story where the performers actually started a fire, burning paper just to try to get some warmth.
They would take newspapers and things like that, anything they had that could burn, trying to keep warm. It was well below zero.
These guys, half of them, didn't know what the weather was going to be like. Richie had never been in snow. Mama had to mail him a coat.
Finally, Buddy Holly decides that he's had enough.
Buddy wanted to get to the next venue, which was Fargo, to do some laundry and get some rest. And they knew what was ahead of him was another long bus ride through the night, and he just couldn't do that. He just refused to. So while he was at the surf that night, he asked the manager if there was any way they could charter a plane. And he said, yeah, actually there is. Right here in Mason City, we have Dwyer Air.
Originally, Buddy Holly chartered the plane for him and his two crickets. At that time were Waylon Jennings and Tommy Alsop. And during the course of the evening, the Big Bopper had talked Waylon Jennings out of his seat. And after the concert was over, just before they left for the airport, Ritchie went over and said, look, I really got to go on this plane. I'm not feeling good at all.
Tommy stuck his hand in his pocket, pulled out a coin, and he goes, I'll flip you for it, Ritchie. Ritchie goes, all right. So he flipped them, and Ritchie called heads.
It came up heads, which would normally be a winning coin flip, but in this case, it turned out to be disastrous.
What happens next will leave a nation in mourning and trigger an avalanche of wild rumors.
He was picking up all of these small pieces and putting them in a barrel. And among the pieces was a gun.
The plane flew only 5 miles before it crashed into a field. The question is, why? The sudden death of 3 rock idols cries out for an explanation. Friends of the pilot, Roger Peterson, can't believe that pilot error caused the crash. In their minds, there must have been some other element.
Roger Peterson, the pilot, had been checking the weather forecast all night from his apartment, and the conditions were deteriorating throughout the night, although they were still good in Fargo, which was their destination. And at the time they were ready to take off, I think he was a little bit concerned about the weather in Clear Lake as well. But the singers were insistent, I'm sure, that they get there. Their bus had already taken off. They had no other way to get to Fargo.
We've heard a lot of stories, you know, that it was pilot error.
Author Gary Moore has also written about the plane crash in his book, Hey Buddy.
Roger Peterson, who by all accounts was a wonderful young man, but he had recently failed his instrument training and his test. There are flight instructors on record saying that he became confused easily and suffered vertigo. And so even if the weather was perfect, it would have been a dangerous flight for that young man to make, but the weather was not perfect.
There's a lot of conjecture as to why Roger Peterson would fly under conditions that he deemed less than satisfactory.
One theory is that Peterson's judgment was overwhelmed by the fame of his 3 rock star passengers. Buddy Holly, for instance, had massive star power.
Buddy was an amazing musician. He was arguably the inventor of the modern style of rock and roll.
And the Big Bopper's monster hit, Chantilly Lace, was at the top of the charts. But nobody knows whether or not the stars convinced the pilot to take off. And even if they did, that wouldn't explain what actually caused the tragedy. A strange discovery at the crash site soon fuels wild speculation.
The mayor of Clear Lake observed that all along the route where there was debris, there were also dozens of candy bars.
A theory begins to circulate that after weeks of touring remote Midwestern towns, somebody on board the plane had run out of drugs and was suffering from withdrawal.
If Roger Peterson balked and said, look, the weather's too bad, that the pressure of getting drugs might have forced somebody to force him to take off.
But Larry Lemmer feels that the chocolate bars may have just been somebody's sweet tooth.
None of the singers that were killed in the crash were drug users. From all indications of interviews with people that were on that tour, drugs were not a problem.
Still, the rumors persist and they gain traction when a startling discovery is made at the crash site 2 months after the tragedy.
The next spring, the farmer that was farming that land went out to work it to plant a crop, and there was still parts of the wreckage that were out there, small pieces. And among the pieces was a gun. And he was very surprised to find the gun, and he called the sheriff to tell the sheriff about it.
They checked the registration, which back then would take 3 or 4 weeks, not having computers, and they found that the gun was registered to Charles Hardin Holly, Buddy Holly's real name.
But some would question why Buddy Holly would have a gun.
Every dime that was taken in cash. They didn't take checks, they didn't take credit cards, and so there were thousands of dollars involved. And Buddy and the tour manager ended up being responsible for that money. And so I find nothing surprising about the fact that Buddy Holly had a gun.
Well, the obvious rumor that surfaced after the gun was found was that somebody had gotten shot on that plane, and presumably it would be the pilot, since he was the one that was controlling the plane. And of course that's a real far-fetched theory when you think they're all on a plane, they all want to get to the next destination. The last thing you want to do is shoot the pilot.
Maybe he was taking out the gun to clean it, or maybe he was reholstering it, or maybe he had taken it out of his suitcase and it accidentally went off and it hit him.
The flight was only about 5 minutes in a darkened cabin without absence of light, and anybody who thinks that anybody was cleaning anything in that cockpit's never been in the cockpit of a Beechcraft Bonanza. There's barely room to squeeze your body in, and so there was no cleaning of the gun.
Another theory, put forth by Jerry Dwyer, the owner of the plane, is that there was bad blood between the 3 musicians. Intense rivalry, exacerbated by the wretched conditions of the tour, led to a fight breaking out on board.
I believe that Jerry Dwyer would like to believe that something happened to bring that plane down that did not involve his decision to put that pilot in that plane that night.
Well, there have been rumors of fights on the plane, and there have been actually witnesses who said that they saw the people on the plane fighting in the cockpit as they took off.
But according to Gary Moore, absolutely nothing in the character of the three musicians supports this idea.
All witnesses say that Buddy Holly was probably the nicest, most amiable person they've ever met. Everybody who knew Ritchie Valens said the exact same thing. In the Big Bopper, I think that people just loved him.
In an effort to get to the bottom of the mysterious crash, 4 experts from the Civil Aeronautics Board arrive in Clearwater to launch an investigation. They begin an exhaustive inquiry, interviewing all those involved and touring the crash site as well as the airstrip. But although their investigation wraps up on February 7th, it will be several months before the report is released. In the meantime, Richie Valens' mother, Concepcion, devastated by the loss of her son, decides to pursue legal action against the owner of the aircraft, Jerry Dwyer.
After the crash, Richie's mother filed a lawsuit in Cerro Gordo County against Jerry Dwyer for $1.5 million, which was at that time the largest civil suit ever filed in the county.
As aircraft owner Jerry Dwyer readies for legal battle, his lawyers warn him to prepare for the worst.
Somebody needed to be held accountable.
Jerry Dwyer was worried. And all you have to do is look at his action.
On June 26, 1959, Concepcion Valenzuela files a $1.5 million wrongful death lawsuit against Jerry Dwyer in Cerro Gordo County, Iowa, alleging that Dwyer let the plane take off on a very stormy and snowy evening. The lawsuit claims that Dwyer's negligence led to Richie's death.
It was the largest lawsuit filed in the county at that time. And presumably they came up with that figure based on what Richie's future earnings would have been.
Indeed. Concepcion's lawyers point out that had Valens lived, he would very likely have earned millions of dollars.
Crash took away just a huge financial engine from the family. Richie's future was wide open at that time. Whether he would have stayed in music, gone into movies, who knows what he would have done. But he would have likely been huge.
Somebody needed to be held accountable. Maybe they shouldn't have taken off that night. Maybe different decisions should have been made.
This was the first real big accident that Dwyer had ever had, and they were operating, without being incorporated in the state of Iowa. And their attorney suggested that they get incorporated right away. The attorney also suggested that if you're ever going to take a vacation, you might want to take it now.
As the two sides prepare for legal battle, the investigators from the Civil Aeronautics Board question Jerry Dwyer about the events leading up to the crash. They quickly established that he was present at the airport when the plane took off.
He helped load the airplane, packed their luggage, put the passengers in their seats, had last-minute conversations with the pilot, Roger Peterson, and the plane took off.
And he watched the lights of the plane going off to the northwest. And as the plane got further away from the airport, it appeared to be going down.
Jerry Dwyer said to the tower operator at the time, says, "I think the plane went down." And the tower operator said, "No, it's an optical illusion. As it moved further away from you, it just looked like it was moving down." I believe Jerry went home at that point and called Fargo, called the tower, and asked if the plane had arrived, and they said no, it had not.
There hadn't been any radio communication for Roger.
Jerry Dwyer was worried. And all you have to do is look at his actions. And in all the years that I owned an aviation service, I never went out to the airport at 1 o'clock to watch a departure. When the weather was incredibly cold, stood outside and watched the plane take off till it was out of sight.
Jerry Dwyer himself said, the little taillights looked like they were sinking. And when I heard that, it's sinking, the first thing that came to my mind was, it's too heavy.
The plane was loaded pretty heavily for a plane of that size, and it's a kind of a skittish plane anyway, so it has a rather delicate flying conditions. And when they did the weight and balance report, they had the weights of some of the singers wrong, they had them in the wrong seats, and they had quite a bit of luggage in the back of the plane as well.
This was a small plane. These were big guys. I mean, Buddy was a big guy, JP was a big guy, and Richie was no featherweight.
What happened next is a matter of debate. For his part, Larry Lemmer believes that the pilot lost sight of the horizon and, not properly trained to rely on his instrument panel, became confused.
Roger Peterson flew the plane into the ground when he thought he was climbing, and that he had undertaken a flight that he was not equipped to handle.
But Gary Moore disagrees with this version of events.
When you're in an airplane going 150 miles an hour, and you have even just a little bit of snow, it looks like you're Han Solo in the Millennium Falcon going warp speed because the snowflakes are coming by you so quickly. So we have no horizon. Pilot's disoriented. The airplane rolls over to its side. Pilot becomes frightened, pulls back on the yoke. It starts spiraling. The more disorientated they become, he pulls back harder. I imagine there was a lot of confusion in the cabin. People yelling, maybe even grabbing for controls at this point.
Unlike those who think the impact came as a surprise, Moore believes the passengers on the plane must have known that it was going down.
The realization that the pilot no longer is in control of the airplane. You look outside and you see the snow whizzing by. You don't know up from down. It was a very tragic end, very frightening end.
One way or another, the plane hits the ground at high speed.
The Fargo airport was expecting the plane to arrive at a certain time, and when the plane didn't arrive, they called back to Mason City to find out what was going on. And Mason City called Dwyer at home to tell him about it.
He went to the airport, got into a plane, and piloted it himself following the flight plan, and just 5 minutes outside of the Mason City airport, he spied what he thought was the wreckage. He descended to get a closer look and in fact saw the unmistakable V-tail of the Beechcraft Bonanza in the field.
He came back to the airport, got out of the plane and said, "They're out there, they're all dead."
I've been told that Dwyer received a lot of death threats, and through the years he has kind of suffered the angst of a lot of angry fans, family members. It must have been a very terrible time, and I think it's also something that you never get over. Buddy and Richie were thrown to the right and left of the airplane, about 20 feet from the plane, but the Big Bopper was found 40 feet on the other side of the airplane, and no one can really understand still to this day how that happened. As a matter of fact, it was a few hours after the crash was found that they even found his body, because they weren't looking on the other side of the fence. So it would be the worst roller coaster ride that you can imagine times 10.
As the investigators for the Civil Aeronautics Board write up their report on the accident, lawyers for Dwyer and Concepcion negotiate back and forth. Finally, just days before the CAB report is due to be issued, they come to a decision. A settlement is reached.
I guess back in the 50s, I was considered a large sum of money.
And a new legal war begins.
If he knew that Bob King was hurting my mom, Richie would have went over there, got that guitar, and busted it probably right over his head.
On September 11th, 1959, a few short days before the CAB report is finally issued, lawyers for Concepcion Valenzuela and Jerry Dwyer reach an agreement and settle out of court.
I don't think she felt that he was responsible, but something happened that shouldn't have happened. The plane crashed. Somebody needed to be held accountable, and it was his service, so he was held accountable.
In the settlement agreement, Dwyer's insurance company agrees to pay out the maximum liability amount for each passenger, $25,000. Although it's far less than the original demand of $1.5 million, Concepcion's lawyers counsel her to accept the settlement.
I guess back in the 50s, I was considered a large sum of money.
Had Dwyer held out for a few more days, he might not have had to pay anything.
The CAB report came to the conclusion that the crash was caused by pilot error, that Roger Peterson misread the instruments, and instead of climbing, he flew right into the ground at full speed.
But many of those connected to the story continue to doubt this conclusion.
We heard that this guy could have driven this plane, you know, blindfolded.
In the report, they made a simple 1 or 2 sentence addition that should have never been made. The artificial horizon that was used in that plane was different than the one that Roger Peterson was trained on. And so they believed that Roger may have thought that he was climbing when he was descending. But the logbooks show that Roger had over 300 hours with this new piece of equipment. And so I don't think there's any chance of that at all.
Although the CAB report absolves him of responsibility, Jerry Dwyer never agrees with its verdict.
Jerry Dwyer, over the years, has maintained kind of a distance from the crash, and he's always indicated that he felt his pilot was something of a scapegoat in this, and he claims to have information that would prove otherwise, but he has never come forward with anything.
In any case, not only has the wrongful death lawsuit been settled, it's been dismissed with prejudice, meaning that the charges can never again be brought against Dwyer. And for the Valenzuelas, the settlement money can only stretch so far.
We went from living in our nice little 3-bedroom, 1-bath house in Pacoima to a house with no heat.
My job was, when I came home from school, we had an old wooden stove because there was no gas stove and no burning stove. My job, before I can go out and play with my buddies, was to get out there, chop all the wood for the stove, feed the goats, feed the pigs that we had, and all the chickens and all that good stuff.
Concepcion manages to eke out a living for her family against the odds.
She would find a way to make a buck, and it was usually with her cooking or helping, you know, out in the field.
And despite the fact that trade magazines had projected $100,000 in earnings for Valens in 1959, the Valenzuelas are having trouble getting royalties from Ritchie's manager, Bob Keane. Attorney Joseph Hart would represent the Valenzuelas against Bob Keane in later years.
Bob was the head of Delphi Records who signed Ritchie back in 1958 to a recording contract.
Not only did Keane produce Ritchie's music, he managed his career. In the year leading up to Valens' death, Keane became very involved in the young rock star's life, even giving him his new stage name, turning Richard Valenzuela into Ritchie Valens. Connie Valenzuela remembers meeting Keane when she was a child.
He was like our grandfather with lots of big presents, with these big old dolls with eyes that opened and closed. And Irma and I were like, wow, and every time he'd come over, he'd bring us presents, little stuffed animals, games. We loved him.
Well, he came over and, you know, he would sit there with my mom, and everything was good that came out, you know, and Richie was happy.
I liked Bob Keane at the time. Well, as far as I was concerned, he was doing something good for Ritchie.
Come On, Let's Go and La Bamba are ongoing hits for Ritchie, and yet the Valenzuelas are receiving little in the way of royalties from them.
La Bamba was one of the most popular songs year after year after year. The amount of money that was being paid by Delphi didn't seem to make sense.
Ritchie's family questioned whether Bob Keane paid all the royalties that were due to him, or due to the family after Ritchie's death. And I think Bob Keane acknowledged that he had paid them something like $13,000 during Ritchie's lifetime.
In addition to this, Keane claims that he loaned the Valenzuelas money.
Before Ritchie was able to buy the house for his mother, he needed money for the down payment. And Bob Keane says that he advanced Ritchie $1,000 from the $13,000 he was going to have coming from royalties so that he would be able to buy the house before he went on that tour.
According to Keane, when tragedy struck, he was the one who paid the bills.
Bob Keane said he spent up to $8,000 to bring Ritchie's body back and to arrange for the funeral.
But for the Valenzuelas, this doesn't explain how Keane treated Concepcion in later years.
He was not paying the royalties that were due her.
She'd talk to him and, okay, Connie, we're gonna pay you, we're gonna be sending you a check. Then we would wait and wait, and before you knew it, we wouldn't get nothing.
The original deal was a 6% deal. Not only was the royalty rate low, but the payments weren't being made even at that low royalty rate, and the accountings weren't being made as they should have been.
We knew that Bob Keane was hurting my mom. Ritchie would have went over there, got that guitar, and busted it probably right over his head.
But he may have felt like he deserved more of a cut of the pie, since Ritchie was really a raw talent when he was discovered by Bob Keane.
The situation drags on into the 1970s.
I went to my mom's and he was crying, and I asked her what was wrong, and she says, well, Bob Keane keeps on putting out albums and everything, and I don't know nothing about it. He hasn't talked to me.
Bob Morales decides to set up a meeting between his mother and Bob Keane.
And it was at Bob's restaurant in North Hollywood at high noon at the lobby, you know. Because he said there to my mom, I own Ritchie's music for eternity. I didn't even tell him, I don't know who elected you, God, but I don't think so, you know.
And that Delphi owned everything outright. They owned all the recordings and would own those recordings forever and ever.
Hart thinks that Ritchie probably didn't really understand the contract he signed with Keane. After all, he was only 17 at the time.
He had no education for this type of thing, and very few people do. The terms are something that only someone in the music industry with experience would have been able to understand.
For Bob Morales, the problems with Keane go beyond the contract and royalty payments.
He put his name on a lot of Ritchie's music, like co-writer on it, which I knew that wasn't so because Ritchie had those songs before he met Bob Keane.
Bob Keane said that he could have taken a lot more credit for the songwriting than he did. He gave a lot of it to the Valens family. I think he felt that was part of being fair with the family.
I guess he felt he made Ritchie, so he owned Ritchie. I didn't like him. I didn't like him for the pain he had caused Mama.
In the 1980s, after years of putting up with the situation, Concepcion finally decides to pursue legal action against Bob Keane.
I think Bob was really shocked that Mama did go after him, because Mama had always been just really kind and kind of passive through it all. But people explained to her, no, Ritchie mattered, but his music matters. You're fighting for your rights as his mom to his music.
He felt that he didn't have to apply or comply with his own contract terms. So in that sense, the treatment of the family by Delphi was really contemptuous.
And as the legal wrangling over Ritchie Valens' legacy continues into the 1980s, Concepcion realizes that her son's enormous contribution to the music industry is being overlooked. The legal conflict between Bob Keane and the Valenzuelas escalates.
He goes, when are you gonna stop suing at me?
And Ritchie's mother finally secures his legacy.
You should have seen the standing ovation she got that day. It was amazing.
In the decades following his death, the film industry had expressed ongoing interest in the Ritchie Valens story.
Through the years, there had been a couple of people that had approached Mom, but nothing ever came of it.
Then, in 1984, a new possibility emerges. Well-known Latino playwright Luis Valdez has long been interested in Ritchie Valens. Valdez meets with the family.
We started hanging out there with them for a while, and then they talked about doing a play.
Valdez introduces the family to movie producer Taylor Hackford. Together, Valdez and Hackford decide that the Ritchie Valens story should be made into a movie. But Ritchie's siblings are ambivalent about the idea.
We weren't sure that we were going to make the movie, because that's exactly what happened. Bob was torn one way, I was torn another. Mario and Irma, they didn't know what to think. And my mom was caught in the middle.
You know what it did? It stirred up a whole lot of fighting.
You know, it was something that we kind of kept inside of us, you know what I mean? Just, we knew our brother was gone and we just dealt with it as best we could, and you know, we really didn't talk much about it at all.
And I remember waking up one night and I'd been praying, literally praying, what's the best thing to do? What do we do? What's the right thing to do? And I literally heard, you do what Mama wants to do. And I'd like to think that was Ritchie. Do what Mama wants.
The family decides to go ahead with the film, but the process turns out to be extremely painful.
Everything Bob had hidden, everything I had hidden, and the things Mama had held. Like I said, nobody ever talked about it. All of a sudden, everybody was just at everybody. Everybody was off to their corners, licking their little wounds and protecting the little dark places where they had hidden.
But difficult as the process is, the Valenzuelas managed to remain intact as a family.
The movie did a lot of healing, you know. I mean, it hurted, but it did a lot of healing for all of us.
For Connie, seeing the actor Lou Diamond Phillips play the part of her brother was particularly helpful.
We were able to finally say goodbye and have somebody to stand in his place to say goodbye to. I know Lou felt the same way. He was Ritchie to us. He became Ritchie, and he knew it.
But for Ritchie's brothers, La Bamba the movie is so real, it still hurts.
I can't watch the movie. I have to leave because when I watch that movie, my head goes to the real thing, you know, I go back. After 50-some years, it still gets to me, you know.
I've watched it many times, but the ending, yeah, this, you know, kicks your ass, you know what I mean? It's like someone goes in or yanks your heart right out. So usually, you know, if we do see it somewhere, you'll see me gone when that time comes.
As the film goes into post-production, Concepcion is still battling Bob Keane for past royalty payments.
She wanted to make sure that everybody was treated equally. So we set up a corporation at her request called High Tone 5. Ritchie used to call Mama High Tone, so we named it after her.
According to the terms of the corporation, Concepcion and her 4 surviving children split the income from Ritchie's estate equally, and that income is about to increase dramatically with the release of La Bamba. But as the premiere date approaches, Concepcion's health worsens. Producer Taylor Hackford calls Concepcion in the hospital.
You know, my mom told him, Taylor, I'm gonna go through this surgery and I'm gonna be fine because I am going to live to see my son's movie.
True to her word, Concepcion makes a triumphant appearance at the premiere of La Bamba.
4 guys picked up the 4 corners of her wheelchair and picked her up on the stage. And you should have seen the standing ovation she got that day. It was amazing.
And Concepcion has another surprise in store for her at the premiere.
When I saw Bob Keane kneel at my mom's chair, she was in a wheelchair. It was they had premiered La Bamba in Hollywood.
And he says, you know, Connie, please forgive me for what happened in these years. And, you know, my mom didn't ask any other questions or anything. And she said, yeah. And he turned around, he hugged her, and she kissed him on the cheek, and he kissed her. And he stayed there.
As La Bamba goes into general release, producer Taylor Hackford warns the family to keep their expectations low.
He goes, Connie, don't expect much. It's just going to be a little sleeper hit. I go, I disagree.
Connie is right. Exceeding everybody's hopes, La Bamba turns into a hit movie, grossing more than $50 million at the box office, as the soundtrack album goes to #1 on the charts, earning the family nearly $1 million in songwriting royalties alone.
And I remember calling him one day and saying, "So Taylor, how would you like your crow cooked?"
Concepcion lives just long enough to see her son's star rise again before she passes away in October of 1987.
She attended all the premieres in her little wheelchair. Her last public appearance was in Watsonville at the Santa Cruz County Fair, just a couple of weeks before we lost her.
And despite Bob Keane's apology to Concepcion at the Hollywood premiere of La Bamba, his company, Delphi, soon finds itself backed into a corner when High Tone 5's lawyers ask to see the company's accounting.
They had no record to show that they had ever accounted, so they were caught red-handed with that one.
After months of haggling, a settlement is reached. Delphi agrees to pay the Valenzuelas $50,000 in back royalties.
The result was that the payment was made for the problematic payments and failure to make payments in the past, and they agreed to make reports on a regular basis going forward.
But the truce only lasts so long. In the mid-90s, the Valenzuelas allege that Keane is withholding payments again.
He was back to his old tricks. He really was. He thought he was going to get away with it. I wanted him so much to be that good person.
Bob Keane just stonewalled and felt that he had been fair to the family and why is this going on, and stood his ground.
But once again, the matter is settled after an arbitration proceeding is filed, and once again, Delphi agrees to pay $50,000 in back royalties. After that, relations between the Valenzuelas and Bob Keane remained strained up until his death in 2009. Irma remembers the last time she saw Bob Keane at a memorial celebration for Richie.
You know, he came up to me and gave me a big old hug, and I turned around and hugged him. And he said, "You know, Irma," he goes, "when are you gonna stop suing at me?" And I said, "You know, Bob, when you stop being a snake."
The last time I talked to Bob Keane was at Ritchie Valens Memorial Park in Pacoima. I sat next to him and I sort of nudged him. I said, "Hello." And he turned around and said, "Are you here as my friend or my enemy?" I said, "What do you prefer?" He said, "My friend." I said, "Well, for today, I'm your friend, okay?"
I'm sure that Bob felt at least hurt, possibly betrayed. Certainly, he discovered Richie, he sharpened his musical focus, and he exposed him to people like radio station people and booked him on tours and released his records. I mean, he played the most important role in Richie's career of anybody.
And while it's true that in Richie Valens, Bob Keane helped create a phenomenon, it took the Valenzuela family decades to win Richie the full recognition he deserved.
That was what my goal was to get America to recognize Richie as a pioneer of rock and roll.
In 2001, Richie Valens is inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, joining the pantheon of rock legends, many of whom, like him, died too young. Richie's legacy is finally secure.
It's become our income, our livelihood, and all because of a 17-year-old, 17, who put his life out there, who put his music out there.
After my brother Richie died, Elvis Presley sent my mom a telegram and said that if nothing would have happened to Richie, he probably would have been the next king of rock and roll.
And although Richie Valens' life was cut short far too early, in the end, his music didn't really die on February 3rd, 1959.
You can take La Bamba 50 years later, which has been out, and play it at any club without no band there or nothing, and play it anywhere. And you know what? That dance floor will get out there, and they'll just get out there and tear it up. You know, so Richie is doing a hell of a great job keeping his own stuff alive.